Good morning, friends. Alright, here's a fun fact for you. Let's start with a fun fact. The hardest exam anywhere in the world, harder than the LSAT, harder than the notorious Gaogao in China, harder than the Indian Institute of Technology's admissions test, which whittles 500,000 qualified applicants down to a mere 1,000, harder than All Souls College in Oxford's famous fellowship exam, which is a 12-hour written test on just one word chosen at random. Harder than all of that. The hardest exam ever devised by humanity is the diploma exam for the court of the master sommelier. For those of you who come from a blue-collar background, for me, a sommelier is someone who sells wine. Since the exam was first introduced in 1977, a mere 262 students have passed the exam, and only 9 of those ever passed at a first sitting. The test itself is pretty straightforward. It's 3 parts. Part 1, you have to demonstrate that you know everything there is to know about wine. Part 2, you have to demonstrate that you have to know everything there is to know about wine service. Those are the easy bits. The third and final part of the Master Sommelier test is this. You get blindfolded and you're given 6 glasses of wine. You have to correctly identify the varietal of grape that's used, where the grape comes from, and the year the wine was made. The exam is so difficult that most top sommeliers working in the world's top restaurants have never passed it. It takes on average 12 years to pass this exam and tens of thousands of dollars just to get this little silly looking badge on the lapel of your suit. But once you get it, here's the best bit, you'll love this. The average salary for someone with this little badge on their lapel, $195,000 US a year, plus tips. Plus tips. So we're looking at $250,000 a year, at least, for drinking wine. I didn't know that was an option when I left high school. What was my careers advisor thinking? Here is the Bible's view. What are you doing? Are you coming to fix me?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Do you want me to start again and tell you about the salary for sommelier? Thank you. Okay, so here's the Bible's view of the Christian life. It's hard. It requires discipline. It requires perseverance. It often involves failure upon failure upon failure, but at the end it's worth it. In the view of the Bible, the goal of heaven is worth any difficulty involved in getting there. In the view of the Bible, the joy of the Christian faith is worth the difficulty of the Christian faith. If this is your first ever visit to our church, let me just explain to you that at the moment we're reading our way through a letter that was written by a man called Paul in the 1st century. And just to clarify, the words that we're reading at the moment were written at a time in this man's life when he was flat broke, he was in prison for things he didn't do, he was betrayed by his closest friends, he was sick and facing the prospect of a premature death. And yet all of that notwithstanding, the main theme of the words he writes is happiness and joy. Let's carry on where we left off last week. Chapter 2, verse 12. He says to his friends, "Therefore, my dear friends," Paul, in what we're about to read, is about to say some rather tough things. And yet he prefixes his tough things with some decidedly girly language. The phrase "dear friends" that you see there on the screen is a translation of a single Greek word agapetoi, which literally means "you who are dearly loved by God." Beautiful language. It's one of Paul's favourite words. Whenever he writes to any of his churches, he always prefixes the stuff he's about to say with this word. And I like it because here's what it means. It means, look, son, we're about to have a tough conversation because frankly there's stuff we need to talk about in your life. There's issues going on, there's whole sorts of areas where you're going desperately wrong, and you're not going to like a lot of the things that I'm about to say. But just to prefix all of that toughness in some kind of framework, I need you to know that one thing isn't up for discussion. One issue is not on the table, and that is what God feels about you. You are dearly loved. That's never up for discussion. That's never negotiable. You're loved. And notice, there's a personal pronoun there in the sentence too. My dear friends. So not only does God love you, but I love you too. Now that we've got that out of the way, shut up and listen. You who are dearly loved, both by God and by me. Then he says, as you have always obeyed. It seems to me that the word obey is a swear word in our culture. In our culture, you can use the O word. You can't, I should say, use the O word unless you're talking about desires or appetites. So if you see a person whom you fancy, it's okay in our culture to say, obey your desires. If you see a chocolate cheesecake that you really ought to avoid, it's okay in our culture to say, obey your appetites. That's all good. But the notion of living one's life in obedience to some kind of moral code or some kind of ethical standard is an anathema to us, particularly where that obedience goes against the grain of our aforementioned desires and appetites. Right? It's just weird in our culture to stick to a moral code. It's just weird in our culture to obey a body of thought that contradicts desire, that contradicts appetite. You crunch up against this all the time. And the particular subject of that obedience, he says, you should continue to work out salvation. Now the word work there means work as in actually produce something. Perhaps where you work, there's people who show up at 9 in the morning and they leave at 5 in the afternoon, and their being there all day contributes absolutely nothing to the business. All they do is use up valuable oxygen. They go to work, but they don't do any work. You know who they are. When the Apostle Paul uses the word work in this sentence, he's thinking about a person who actually produces something. So perhaps he's thinking about one of those home-based artisans that were common in the first century. Someone making, a rug. So they would go into their workshop in their house at 9 in the morning, and they'd do the warp and the weft thing all day and put their shuttle back and forth. And by 5 o'clock in the afternoon, they'd produced 6 inches of a rug. When Paul uses the word work with salvation as an object, what he means is this. And this matters. If you're a Christian, your Christianity should show up somehow, somewhere, sometime in your life. Pretty fair statement. You're a Christian, not up for discussion. God loves you, not up for discussion. All of that, somewhere in the 24 hours of your day, should show up in the way you speak, in the way you think, in the way you behave, in the things you choose to live your life for. So to continually work out your salvation means to continually make the effort to produce some kind of evidence of Christianity in the 24 hours of your day. And notice he says that this effort that you are to make is something that you should do with, and then he mentions 2 emotions, fear and trembling. I quite like this from a sales perspective. We don't, as you perhaps know, buy things for logical reasons. Ladies, I'll pick on you because I like that. So take that expensive purse you have. You didn't buy that for any sensible, logical reason. There's no reason to have a $250 purse. A plastic bag from the store does just as well. I'm sorry, gentlemen, did I just crack a joke? Right, it performs exactly the same function. You don't need a $250 thing with Kate Moss or whatever her name is on the side of it. It's I know the real stuff. I'm just kidding. It's silly. So whatever it was that motivated you to buy that, there was some emotion involved. You had a picture of how it would feel when you would buy that bag, and so on and so forth. The Bible is doing this exact same thing with God here. I would like for you, the apostle seems to be saying, to imagine how it will feel on day one of heaven. I would like for you to imagine how it will feel when you've shuffled off this mortal coil and popped your clogs, or whatever it is people do, and there you are, cartoon imagery, before the pearly gates. God is there, St. Peter's there, the book is there, I don't know, all that stuff. I don't need to spell out in too much detail. How will it feel? The emotions that the Bible wants us to get into when thinking about that stuff veer towards the negative. We're talking here about God. There ought to be, in the Bible's point of view, a little bit of dry-throatedness going on. A little bit of ooh. A little bit of scariness. This is God, we are not, and yet our future is at stake. Enough said. And Paul uses this emotion. Emotions are good for getting you to do things. From buying bags to living right. Paul wants you to use this dry-throated, scared emotion to get you to pull up your socks and make some kind of effort to let your Christianity that you've already got find its way into your behavior, into your conversation, into your thoughts, and so on. All right? Fair enough? So verse 12 isn't pretty. Verse 12 is all about get a grip on your life. Develop some discipline. I don't know. Get yourself a moral code and stick to it. Get yourself an ethical standard and maintain it. Be nice to old people. Help people across the road. Stop gossiping. Stop flirting with your neighbour's husband. Obey the 10 Commandments. You know. In something. In addition to coming to church, start allowing the teachings of Jesus to shape your behaviour, because, gulp, one day you will stand with fear and trembling before God, and your life will be examined. And the subject of that examination will be how you lived. All right? And then it changes in the next verse. Curiously, having said in verse 12, you have to do stuff. You have to work at your Christianity. You have to dig deep and show evidence of your faith in the way you live. He then in the next sentence says, look at it, it is God who works in us to will and to act. Do you see the contrast between these two sentences? Verse 12 was all about you've got to do stuff. But then in the next sentence he says, it's God who's doing stuff. Verse 12 is your job. Verse 13 is God's job. What's going on? Simple. When the New Testament talks about our Christian life, it always does so in a two-handed, two sides of the coin kind of the way. On the one hand, the New Testament makes these big, deep, bold, stirring, indicative statements. The New Testament says, unapologetically, this is who you are. You are Christian. You are a saint. You are righteous in God's sight. It doesn't say you should be those things, it says you are those things. You don't feel like you are, but the New Testament insists that you are. You are Christian. You're right in the sight of the God who is your judge. You are a saint. Done, dusted, complete. And then it says, because of who you are, there are consequences arising out of who you are. Like, live like who you are. For example, have a look at this. So Paul wrote to a group of Christians in the early church, and he said to them, you died. That person you used to be, those attitudes you used to have, those habits that used to tear you down, you know, all of who you used to be died. The sin bit of you died. And your life is now hidden with Christ in God. When God looks at you, he doesn't see you. He sees Jesus with all of his perfection and all of his goodness. So you're good, you're good, you're good. You died. And then it says, now put to death whatever belongs to your sinful nature. You know, lust, impurity, greed, whatever. You see that? Here's the truth. It's not up for discussion. You are this. And this is awesome. Now, be this. Be who you already are. Christianity isn't about becoming something. It's just about being who you already are. About letting out the Christian inside you. I mean, God's already done it. You just got to be it. Right? So back to our text. Verse 13 is one of these great statements of truth. I love when the Bible says stuff like this. God is working and acting, doing words, to bring about his good purpose in your life. Now remember the context of the author. Prison. Betrayed. Sick. Broke. Premature death. And in that place he's talking about God's good purpose. I'm liking this. When Paul talks about God's good purpose in the life of a Christian, he's usually talking about something rather specific. He's talking about day one of heaven. He's talking about that scene before the pearly gates, the cartoon imagery that we mentioned a moment ago. And he's talking about that day going extraordinarily well for the likes of you and the likes of me. And when I say the likes of you and the likes of me, you know what I mean, right? Not too great people. People whose Christianity is imperfect at best. Shabby more often than not. He's talking about people like you and people like me and that day one of heaven going very well. He's talking about that moment where God says, look, you're good. You're righteous in my sight. You're forgiven. You're Christian. Go on in. Make yourself at home. I think you'll like it. God, Paul believes, is working your life towards that point, beyond which the difficulty of life will not matter. Then he says, therefore, in verse 14, do everything without complaining or arguing. The Bible really hates whingers. So Paul's taking this sentence from way back in that story in the book of Exodus. Remember the one where God takes the people of Egypt the people of Israel out of Egypt. And in Egypt they've got this miserable situation. And the story in a nutshell is, I'm going to take you out of this miserable situation over here, and I'm going to take you to this awesome situation over here, land flowing with milk and honey, whatever. But the people said, we don't like it. Where are we going? How long will it take? We don't like the foods. We don't like sand in our toes. And God's view was harsh on them. God's view was, I wanted to take you from something horrible to something beautiful, but you just couldn't be bothered. You just couldn't be motivated to get from here to here. You just couldn't get past your complaining. You couldn't get past your whinging. One of my favourite shows on TV for a while was Gordon Ramsay's Kitchen Nightmares. Remember that show? So the premise of the show was Gordon Ramsay, who was one of the top, I think is still one of the top chefs in the world. I don't think anyone has more Michelin stars than he does. Certainly fantastic at making money from the food business. And the premise of the show was this top money-making chef would go into a small mom-and-pop restaurant, and he would say, look, no offence, but you're doing it wrong. You need to change your menu, you need to change your decor, you need to change your prices. And if you do these simple steps that I'm showing you, things you can absolutely do, your business will start to work, you'll make more money, and your family will be happier, and your wife will love you again. And it just amazed me how person after person in that show would listen to the advice of this successful guy who wanted to help them, and they would say, no, I don't like it. I don't like it, I don't want to do it. That's not how we do things. That's not how we behave. That's not how we run this shop. This is the exact nuance of the word complain and argue in today's sentence. Don't be like that, Paul is saying. If you want to get from here to over here, you need to move it. You need to put one foot in front of the other and move forward. And if you just get stuck in complaining and whinging and arguing, that's all you've got. I bet you know people like this in your life, right? The last time you met them 10 years ago, they were whinging and arguing and moaning about something. And then you banged into them recently, and it was the same. They were still whinging about the same stuff, still complaining about the same stuff, still the same woe is me story. And they never moved anywhere because they just got stuck in whinging and complaining and arguing about life rather than just moving forward and getting on with things. Paul is saying, listen. God loves you. Do you understand that? Like the God who has impossibly high standards, for some reason of his own choosing, he loves you. This is for your own good. That same God is working in your life. He is taking you towards a very, very good future. Good beyond your wildest dreams. Just cooperate with him. Stop complaining and start letting your Christianity out. What's the worst that can happen? Then he says in the next sentence, so that you may be blameless and pure, children of God without fault, in a crooked generation in which you shine like stars in the universe. Then at the end of verse 16 we get a glimpse into what Paul's looking forward to. Remember again the context: prison, broke, sick, premature death. Here's what's in it for me, Paul says. I want to boast on the day of Christ that I didn't labour or run in vain. Paul was a bit of a runner in his younger days. I think he talks about running all the time. Here he is at the end. And from a certain point of view, Christianity didn't work for him. I mean, do you ever think life screwed you over? Just me, okay. No, seriously, do you ever think this? I think it's hard not to get into your 40s and 50s and 90s or wherever you are, and not look back and think, you know what, I think I deserve better than I got. Spare a thought for Paul. Good guy. Like, kicked off Christianity in Europe. Planted a zillion churches. Introduced countless people to the Christian faith. What does he get for his trouble? At the end? There's no fancy, bed in a nursing home for him. With a full-time, dedicated nurse or whatever. He's in prison. It's probably dark most of the day. He's got nothing. No money, no health, very few friends. It's nothing. That's what he gets. So he's concerned that he didn't go through all that for nothing. He wants something out of it at the end. And what he wants is for the particular church he's writing to let their Christianity out. Because if they let their Christianity out, then at least he spent his life on something. That's his prize. That's his medal. He says at the end, I'm broke, I'm sick, I'm dying. I've literally spent my life so that you and people like you can let your Christianity out in the places where you live. And I'm praying that you will, so that on the day of Christ, which is another Bible phrase for day one of heaven, it'll all work out for me. And I'll get to hear Jesus say what I want him to say. Well done. Well done. Then he says, even if I am being poured out like a drink offering on the sacrifice and service coming from your faith, I am glad and I rejoice with all of you. Look at the vocabulary in that final sentence. I'm being poured out. What happens when you take a bottle and you pour it out? What are you left with? Nothing. Empty. Do you ever feel that the life you're living leaves you empty? Exhausted? Spent? Do you ever feel this way at the end of the week? You're like a squeezed lemon. And there is nothing left. No, is that just me? Do you ever feel this way? Like life just with family and the boss and friends and family. Did I mention family twice? Family. And all the other stuff, there's always stuff, and it just squeezes you, and there's nothing left. Paul feels this way, and yet there is happiness. Why? Because he is squeezed out in a cause. In his case, the church he loves. In your case, I think the cause is probably no less worthwhile. What are you squeezed out for? About 90% of it is family. I bet the other 10% of it is stuff you do for your family. That's good. and you're happy to do it. It is possible to be squeezed out and empty and also happy, knowing that it is all in a good cause and for the right thing. You're Christian. God likes you, loves you. What you are in God's sight is not up for any discussion. You are good. Let it out a little. It's honestly not that hard. Thank you for coming. God bless you. See you next week.